The engines did not roar. They purred like sewing machines in the dark. Two young women, faces streaked with oil and windburn, pushed a fabric and wood biplane out of a snow-dusted revetment. The night smelled of petrol and pine, the breath of the steppe cold enough to bite through uniforms. Somewhere far to the west, the front lines trembled, artillery thumped, flares clawed at the sky, and the wind carried a low growl of mechanized war. But here, at the edge of an unlit field, there were only shadows and whispers. "Ready?" the pilot asked. The navigator nodded, tightening the scarf at her throat. She was 19. The pilot was 20. Their aircraft, a Polikarpov Po-2, had a top speed barely faster than a car on a country road and wings stretched tight with canvas. The Germans mocked it as a sewing machine, a toy, an antique. The two women treated it like a blade. They were part of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Red Army Air Force, a unit made up entirely of women. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers. They flew without radios, without parachutes in the early months, and often with maps sketched by hand. The Germans would come to call them Die Nachthexen, the night witches, not because of superstition, because of the sound their planes made when the engines were cut on final approach. A soft whoosh of canvas through black air, like the sweep of a broom across the moon. The pilot coaxed the little engine to life. A cough, a stutter, and then the soft, steady murmur that felt more heartbeat than power. The Po-2 rolled forward, skis whispering over frozen earth. Ahead, a tunnel of darkness. Overhead, a thin smear of stars. They did not switch on landing lights. They did not signal the tower. They lifted into night like a secret. This, too, was war. The 588th had been born from a dare that sounded like an insult. In October 1941, as the Wehrmacht punched deep into Soviet territory and the Red Army reeled, a famed aviator named Marina Raskova, the Soviet Amelia Earhart, holder of long-distance records and a national hero, petitioned Joseph Stalin to create women's combat air units. Not women ferrying aircraft, not women only in workshops, but women flying into combat. She didn't ask nicely. She demanded. The answer came back with the force of a decree. Form them. 3 regiments were raised, trained, and deployed. A fighter regiment, a dive bomber regiment, and a night bomber regiment, the 588th. Raskova recruited from across the Soviet Union. Students, teachers, farmhands, factory workers, girls who had grown up under the wide, iron-gray skies of the steppe and learned to read the weather like scripture. Many had never seen a cockpit before. Within months, they would fly through flak in moonless darkness and land by touch. They cut their issued men's uniforms down to size with scissors. They learned to file their boots so they would not twist an ankle sprinting across frozen fields. They greased their own propellers, patched their own fabric, and slept beside their planes on nights when snow fell so quietly the world seemed to hold its breath. They did not ask for special treatment. They asked for fuel and bombs. The Po-2 was a relic, even then: wooden ribs, canvas skin, an open cockpit that turned the pilot's face into stone with cold. But the plane carried gifts no modern machine could offer at night. It flew slow, it could turn on a whisper, it could drop to treetop height and vanish. Radar struggled to catch it. Searchlights often swept right past it, blind to the little ghost circling in their glare. The tactic was simple and savage. Crews flew in packs of harassing sorties, 3 planes at a time against a single target. The first 2 would dive toward the defended area, engines buzzing, drawing the searchlights and dragging flak into a white-hot storm. The third would slip in from another angle, throttle back, and then cut the engine entirely. The little biplane became a glider, a shadow. It drifted over the target, an ammo dump, a bridge, a bivouac, and the navigator would lean out into the slipstream and hand-drop a small string of bombs. Then the pilot would yank the engine back to life and disappear into blackness before the Germans figured out where the death had come from. When the bombs detonated, Germans swore they heard cackling in the wind. Superstition grew in trenches the way mold grows in damp. Flak crews cursed witches and slept badly. The truth was uglier and braver. The women were exhausted, hungry, frostbitten, and running on nerves and will. On a good night, each crew might fly 6 to 8 sorties. On a brutal night, 12, sometimes more. Up, refuel, rearm, up again. Breath crystallizing on scarves, fingers numb inside thin gloves, oil thickening like tar. A misjudged crosswind could flip the little biplane on landing and trap a crew under wood and canvas. A single tracer could ignite the fuel tank and turn the plane into a falling lantern. They did it anyway, because the front needed the night to be long. The two women in the Po-2 on this night were typical of the regiment. Nadia, the pilot, calm hands, a scowl so fierce she rarely needed to talk. Sophia, the navigator, cheeks raw with wind, compass hung on a worn leather strap, map in a metal case wedged between her knees. They had learned each other's breathing in the dark. They could feel tension through the stick, hear fear in the rustle of paper. 40 degrees left, Sophia said quietly, not looking up. The pilot eased the stick. The plane obeyed with the delicacy of a kite. Below, the ground was a quilt of shadows. Above, the moon was a thin coin, more rumor than light. They flew over the sharp scent of pine, then over the damp, iron tang of a river star speckled black, wide as a secret. Somewhere beyond that river lay German bivouacs and ammunition dumps. Somewhere beyond those, a battery that had shelled Soviet lines until the trenches shook. The women had a message for that battery. The air thickened with searchlights before the girls could see their target. White columns raked the sky, steady, patient, then jittery with alarm as a decoy flight farther west darted in and out of the beams. The flak began like popcorn, isolated, spitting, then settled into a heavy regular beat. The Po-2 shivered as black blossoms, puffs of exploding shells pattered shrapnel against her wings like sleet. On time, Sophia whispered. She kissed her gloved fingers and tapped the map. She wore her father's old watch. It had fogged. Hold! Nadia's voice was almost nothing. She breathed through her teeth, listening to the engine. Listening for the note that meant catastrophe. There. The target spilled its own pale light. 2 long ammo sheds, roof lines like chalk strokes, lines of trucks with hoods thrown back like open mouths. The Germans had been told the night witches used relics. They had not been told relics could be precise. Now, Sophia said. Nadia's gloved hand slid the throttle forward a hair, then backward, then closed it. The engine coughed. Stopped, the world snapped to silence. Only wind, only the hiss of canvas through the night. The Po-2 floated ghost light, patient as a leaf. Sophia leaned out, fingers tight on the bomb lanyard, eyes leaking from the cold. She counted heartbeats. Wind tried to tear her hood away. She imagined the lines of German helmets below, the tilt of a lantern, a sentry's cigarette jeweled in the dark. Now, she said again, and pulled. The bombs fell like stones dropped into a well. Sophia ducked back in, yanked the hood down tight, clapped her hands once to feel them. Nadia waited. Waiting was the blade's edge. The first detonation punched the air flat. Light strobed across the underside of the wings, sharp and ghastly. The second and third walked down the shed roofs and peeled them back like tin, scattering glowing arcs of timber and corrugated metal. Trucks leapt like fish. Men ran, small and frantic. A delayed round inside the shed cooked off with a whiplash crack, then another, then another. The ammo dump began to cascade. Nadia pushed the throttle forward. The engine caught with a petulant bark, then a steady murmur. Searchlights converged too late, drawn by the flash, crossing and recrossing the place where a plane had been. But the night witch was already gone low, 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 hugging the black seam of a river. Only after they were 2 valleys away did Nadia breathe. Sophia laughed once, a bark of joy that surprised both of them. The sound hung in the frozen air like a bright thread. Again, she said. Nadia checked the fuel, felt the ache in her jaw and hands, smiled like a razor. Again. They were not invulnerable. They learned that every night. Exit too high, and searchlights stitched you to the firmament like a specimen. Cut the engine too soon, and a gust would drop you into the treetops like a thrown coat. Judge a flare's distance wrong, and you would turn across a cone of light into a snowstorm of tracers. They learned the recipe of their survival the way pianists learn scales, through repetition until instinct replaced thought. When a crew didn't return, mechanics kept working. No ceremony, not then. At dawn, a hole on the flight line. After breakfast, the armorer rolled a bomb back onto its rack, sighed through her teeth, and scrubbed her hands with a rag that never came clean. At dusk, someone else took that empty slot and flew. The regiment slept under wings and awoke with frost stiff in their hair. They wore their grief locked inside their flight jackets. Heavy, lined, warm enough to keep the body going, never enough for the heart. Letters came when they came. Mothers lost daughters. Sisters told the same lie in a dozen villages. She is fine, she is flying. She will write when she can. The girls tattooed the names of the lost into their habits, check mixture at idle, kiss the watch at 3 minutes to target. Remember Katya? Aim short in cold air. Remember Anya? Always cut the engine after turning windward. Remember Zoya. Memory wove itself into every small motion until superstition and skill became the same animal. Bomb by bomb, night by night, the night witches crawled across maps like a shadow that no dawn could clear. They met the enemy up close too. One midnight in thaw, a Po-2 crept home with a fuel leak and clipped a fence on landing. The little aircraft spun, toppled, and came to rest belly down at the edge of the field. The pilot Yevdokia, sharp eyes, blunt hands, kicked the cockpit latch open, drove her shoulder into the wing root, and bullied the plane upright before the leaking fuel reached the hot exhaust. The navigator limped around the nose and thumped Yevdokia on the arm. You idiot. You genius. You idiot. Together they wrestled the Po-2 back onto level ground while ground crew sprinted with chalks and curses. By sunrise the mechanics had patched the wing with doped canvas and a prayer. By nightfall the same crew flew the same airframe back into the dark, as if the incident had been a rehearsal for a trick. The Po-2 forgave errors the way old horses forgive children. The women loved them the way soldiers love canteens and boots, intimately, defensively, without poetry, until someone else tries to insult them, then with the poetry of knives. The regiment's first months near the Terek and Don were a grindstone. They flew from fields that were barely fields, places you could miss with a lantern in your hand. They hauled bombs on sledges when trucks bogged in thaw. They marked runway edges with kerosene tins punched with holes and lit like tiny, defiant constellations. When fuel ran thin, they rationed heat and coffee. When coffee ran thin, they pretended the hot water was still coffee if you closed your eyes while drinking it. They learned to navigate by the negative space of light. The blacker ribbon that meant river. The absence of farmyard lamps where German bivouacs had pushed the locals out. The thin graphite smear of a road in moonlight. When clouds swallowed the sky, they flew by reckoning, by wind on cheek, by the feeling of distance that 100 hours aloft carves into bone. Eventually, the rumors caught up with them like a tailwind. The Germans began posting bounties, down a night witch and earn a medal. Flak commanders trained searchlight crews to cross-beam at low altitude. Patrols set listening posts with metal cones to catch the faint murmur of a tiny radial engine threaded into the wind's own voice. Luftwaffe pilots sneered in mess halls, and then, in the same breath, griped that these ridiculous biplanes flew too slowly to lock a proper firing solution. One ace wrote home that chasing a Po-2 at night felt like trying to punch fog. By the time you'd lined her up, she had dropped into a gully and vanished. Ridicule turned to irritation. Irritation turned to fear. Because sleep at the front became a liability. Because a warm stove drew bombs. Because a cluster of trucks on a moonlit lane felt like a sign written in a language only witches could read. On a rare day off, the 588th laughed like the teenagers many of them still were. They sewed patches onto sleeves, tiny broomsticks, stars, black cats sketched quick in thread. They told the same story, a dozen different ways. How Nadia Popova flew so many sorties one night, she forgot what ground smelled like. How Yekaterina Ryabovova leaned out so far dropping a stiff bombs that her scarf snapped loose and flicked into the prop like a snake. How Raskova herself had once forced a long-range crash landing in the wilderness before the war and walked with frost-bitten feet to save her crew. They whispered about the fighter girls of the 586th and the dive bomber women of the 587th Sisters on other fronts, carving their own legends. They argued about which male regiment respected them and which still rolled eyes. Someone produced a harmonica. Someone else produced a contraband jar of jam. For 20 minutes the hut sounded like a party. Then the duty officer opened the door and the cold walked in with her. They shrugged on fur-lined jackets and the hardness returned to their faces as easily as breath. Night had fallen again. Time to make it longer for the enemy. That evening Nadia and Sophia were assigned a bridge, a narrow span of timber and steel that fed ammunition and warm bodies into a salient menacing the Red Army's flank. Destroying it would be like kneecapping a giant, not fatal, but decisive. The approach was worse than the target. The Germans had learned the Po-2's habits: low entry, engine cut, drop and vanish, and had threaded their defenses accordingly. Instead of massed searchlights, they had posted pairs along probable approach lines, angled low like foxes crouched along a hedgerow. The flak wasn't heavy. It was clever, stitched at right angles to catch a gliding biplane as it floated across a fixed cone of night. At the briefing, the regiment's commander, a woman with a map folded permanently into her voice, tapped a pencil at the creek line and said, "They want you to come in east to west. Don't pull north. Use the ravine. Aim for the generator truck, not the span. If you take out their eyes, the second wave can do the work." Nadia turned the plan into instinct. Sophia built the run into a sequence and numbers. They went up last, when the night had already learned the shape of the enemy's attention. As they crossed the ravine, barely more than a wrinkle in the land, the searchlights flared 2 fields over, hunting decoys. The Po-2 slipped into the shallow river like a swan skimming a black canal. The engine note dropped and then vanished. Even the wind seemed to hold still. The generator truck wore a faint halo of light, a moth's luminance. The bridge beyond it loomed like a giant's ribcage. Sophia's mittened hand hovered over the lanyard. "Long," she murmured. "Long?" Now. The first pair of bombs slapped the ground just short of the truck and bounced, a wicked gift of soft soil and flight speed. The generator box leapt and turned into a hive of sparks, then into a rolling black. The searchlights along the approach winked out, confusion racing down cables like frightened cats. Nadia had already banked away to give the second wave their line. Flak stitched the night behind them, angry and blind. They landed on a strip without edges, guided by 2 coins of red cloth held up by ground crew. One high, one low, ghost hands in the dark telling them where the world ended. The skis bit hard. The biplane hopped once and settled. Sophia's laugh sounded like a sob. Nadia's hands shook when she reached for the chocks. They did not linger. Refuel, rearm, up again. Across the river the bridge still stood, but the eyes guarding it were closed. By dawn, a male regiment flying twin-engine machines finally took the span apart with heavy ordnance. Their after-action report mentioned excellent pre-suppression by female night bombers. The 588th mechanics passed the line around the hut at breakfast and snorted into their mugs. The night witches did not need praise to know the shape of their work. The emptier the enemy's road at sunrise, the better they had done. As winter deepened, the regiment's logbooks filled with sorties like beads on a thread, 7 in a night, 9, 11 each, a slice of risk and will. The Germans shifted, fell back, dug in, shifted again. The war moved like weather. The women moved with it, a season of their own. They were not phantoms. They were not myths. They were professionals who learned to make a fragile machine immortal in the one way that mattered. Through repetition under fire. They were young, and they grew old in months. They went to war with notebooks and came back with habits carved into bone. They built a reputation so sharp that grown men, veterans of Poland, France, the Balkans, flinched at the sound of canvas in a night wind. By the time the ice broke on the rivers and the first dirty flowers clawed through the thaw, the night witches had flown thousands of missions. The front had shifted. The Germans had learned new words for fear. The 588th had learned new words for grief. But they were still there at dusk, pulling a little wooden airplane out of its bed and tipping its nose toward the dark like a promise. The broom in the sky, the whisper in the wind, the math of courage done by hand. The night witches lifted. into a moonless horizon. By the winter of 1942, the night witches were no longer a rumor. They were a weapon. They were the nightmare that crept across the frozen steppe, whispering death in a language only the dark could understand. German soldiers had a bounty on their heads now. Any pilot who shot one down would earn the Iron Cross. But how do you hunt what you can't see? How do you chase death itself when it moves slower than your shadow and quieter than your breath? The answer was simple. You don't. You wait. You hide. You pray the wind doesn't carry that soft, hissing sound again. Because when it does, it means the witches are already above you. The Germans tried everything to stop them. They raised searchlight fences that turned the horizon into a maze of beams. They parked anti-aircraft guns on every crossroads, along every bridge, near every depot. They listened for the faintest hum in the night, the buzz of a single engine that meant death was coming on wings of cloth and courage. But no matter how many defenses they built, the night witches slipped through. They learned to fly lower than the treetops, brushing branches with their wingtips. They learned to cut their engines early, glide silently over the target, and restart the propeller with a prayer and muscle memory as they dove into the black. Every time they came back alive, it was a miracle. Every time they didn't, their sisters flew the next mission as if nothing had changed. Because that was the unspoken law of the regiment. We do not stop. We do not cry until the night ends. That winter, the regiment was relocated closer to the Stalingrad front. The Germans had surrounded the city, and the Soviets had surrounded the Germans in turn. A massive ring of steel and snow, one of the greatest battles in human history unfolding below the clouds. The 588th was given a simple order: cut off everything that moves. Ammunition, fuel, supplies, anything that tried to reach the trapped German Sixth Army. The night witches became vultures circling the corpse of an empire. They struck supply columns crawling along frozen roads, hit makeshift airfields carved out of ice, burned fuel depots and food caches meant for starving soldiers. They flew in teams, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, and as the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, their missions grew more dangerous. It was in those months that one of the most famous duels of the war began, a battle not between armies, but between two people. Nadia Popova, one of the best pilots in the regiment, had become something of a legend among her comrades. She was calm under fire, ruthless in the sky, and impossibly precise with her landings. The kind of pilot you followed without question. But she also had something else, a reputation among the Germans. One night in January 1943, as Nadia and her navigator Yekaterina Ryabova flew a low-level strike near the Don River, a German fighter appeared out of nowhere. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek, deadly, fast enough to eat the little Po-2 alive. No one should have been flying that night, not in that weather, not in that cold. But he was there, circling her like a wolf. Nadia cut her engine and dropped into the darkness. The Messerschmitt roared past overhead, the pilot's head twisting, searching, straining to find her. She let the silence swallow her. The wind howled through the wires of her wings like the cry of a ghost. Then, with a sharp yank, she reignited the engine and turned hard toward the river. Tracer fire stitched the sky behind her. Rounds hissed past, close enough to feel in her teeth. Yekaterina shouted directions over the wind. Left! Now right! Climb, Nadia, climb! But Nadia didn't climb. She dove. The German followed. Faster, heavier, built for speed, but not built for this. The Po-2 slipped under the tree line, skimming the black surfaces of the river like a shadow. The fighter above couldn't follow. One wrong move and he'd smash himself into the ground. He pulled up, circled, and vanished into the storm. The night witch escaped. Barely. Later that night, the German pilot dropped leaflets over Soviet positions, a personal challenge. To the woman who flies the wooden coffin, come again, witch. I'll be waiting. For 3 nights, Nadia searched for him. Each time she flew over the same sector, waiting for the flash of his gunfire, the scream of his engine. Nothing. On the 4th night, she found him. He came at her out of the clouds like a hawk. She waited until the last second, then cut the engine again. The Messerschmitt dove straight through her slipstream and into the dark. He fired, missed, fired again. Then, a flash, not from her guns, from the ground. A Soviet anti-air battery watching the duel from below had taken its shot. The fighter exploded in a blossom of orange and black. The sound rolled across the steppe like thunder. Nadia never saw a parachute. She didn't cheer. She didn't speak. She simply turned the little Po-2 toward home, flying through the smoke of the fire that had tried to kill her, and whispered into the freezing wind, "Good night, Hunter." By the time the Battle of Stalingrad ended in February 1943, the Night Witches had flown over 1,000 missions in support of the siege. They had bombed railways, bridges, ammo dumps, convoys, every artery feeding the German army's dying heart. Their planes carried only 6 tiny bombs each, but the effect was enormous. The psychological toll on the Germans was devastating. Men who had faced tanks and artillery without flinching now jumped at the sound of wind in the dark. The legend grew. The whispers spread. The Night Witches had become part of the landscape of fear. The victory came with a price. The regiment's casualty rate was among the highest in the entire Soviet Air Force. A bad landing, a stray shell, an engine failure in the cold. Any of these could kill, and yet they kept flying, because the war was not over. Because there were still cities to save and enemies to haunt, because the night still belonged to them. When spring came and the thaw began, the ground crews wept, not from joy but from exhaustion. The mud made takeoffs nearly impossible. Engines clogged, wheels sank. The Po-2s wheezed and sputtered, but the women kept pushing them into the air like they were made of hope and iron. When the order finally came to move west, to follow the retreating Germans into the heart of Europe, they didn't celebrate. They packed their tools, folded their scarves, and looked once more at the fields they had lived and bled on for half a year. They didn't leave flowers. They didn't need to. The ground already remembered. At the next base, a German prisoner asked a mechanic how many men flew in their squadron. The mechanic laughed, not kindly, but not cruelly either. "Not men," she said. "Witches." The man frowned. "Why witches?" The mechanic glanced up at the darkening sky, where the first Po-2s were already rising like paper ghosts. "Because when they come," she said, "you don't hear them, you just die." That night, as the first mission of the new campaign began, Nadia Popova pulled her wool cap low and tightened her gloves. Yekaterina sat beside her, map unfolded, pencil ready. The air smelled of thawing earth and oil. The stars burned low and sharp. "Ready?" Nadia asked. Her navigator smiled. "Always." The engine purred. The Po-2 rolled. The night opened like a door, and the witches flew again. The spring thaw of 1943 did not bring warmth to the Eastern Front. It brought mud. Deep, sucking, treacherous mud that could swallow a truck to its axles and choke an engine in minutes. For most air regiments, this was a season of frustration. For the Night Witches, it was a season of transformation. Their wooden aircraft, so light they could be lifted by hand, could still take off from strips where airplanes sank like stones. The women of the 588th learned to read mud like others read clouds. They knew which patches hid water, which held roots, which could give an extra heartbeat of lift before the wheels left the earth. They learned it because they had to, because the war was moving, and they had to move with it. Their next destination was a place whispered across both armies. Kursk. What awaited them there was not just another battle. It was the largest armored engagement in the history of the world, a collision of steel and fire so enormous that even the sky trembled when it began. The Night Witches were heading straight into its heart. The calm before the thunder. By June 1943, Soviet intelligence had uncovered Hitler's new plan. Operation Citadel, a massive pincer attack designed to cut the Kursk salient in half, destroy the Red Army forces inside it, and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. It would be the turning point of the war. The Soviets knew it. The Germans knew it. And the Night Witches were ordered to prepare for the greatest series of night operations they had ever flown. When they reached their new base, little more than a field threaded with trenches and lined with birch trees, they found mechanics already there, sleeves rolled, tools laid out. Bombs were arranged like metal eggs on wooden racks. Trucks idled, coughing diesel into the air. The sky was clear, too clear. Nadia Popova looked at the horizon and said quietly, "We're standing on the edge of something terrible." And she was right. The first nights of the Kursk offensive on July 4th, the German offensive began with a thunder that shook the earth. Artillery screamed. The ground buckled. The dawn sky was swallowed by smoke. Then came the tanks, Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinands, machines of such brutal power that entire Soviet regiments broke at the sight of them. They rolled forward like steel mountains, grinding earth and bone beneath their tracks. But the night witches did not meet them in daylight. They waited for night. They waited for darkness to level the playing field, because metal does not see well in the black. The order came at dusk: harass the armor columns, disrupt supply lines, cut them apart. The 588th took to the air in waves, 10 planes, then 12, then 15. The sky filled with the faint hum of their tiny engines, a whispered promise of destruction. They flew low, lower than they had ever flown before, because German armor columns traveled with mobile flak units, 20mm cannons that could spit a wall of fire into the night sky. But the Po-2 could slip where nothing else could. It dipped beneath the level of the flak arcs. It vanished against the tree line. It became part of the night. Sophia, in Nadia's back seat, whispered coordinates: convoy at 51 degrees north, moving slow, target 4 trucks, second wagon carrying ammo. She didn't have to finish the sentence. Nadia cut the engine. The Po-2 fell into a glide. Below them, headlights crawled along a dirt road like insects. Trucks loaded with shells, tankers hauling fuel, half-tracks carrying troops toward the front. Sophia leaned out. The wind tore at her hood. Her eyes watered from the cold and smoke. She released the bombs. A second later, the night erupted. The tanker truck ignited like a struck match. A column of flame tore into the air, lighting the treetops. Men ran, silhouettes twisting in the firelight. Tanks halted, unsure where the attack came from. The Po-2 slipped away, silent, invisible. Nadia restarted the engine. They climbed back into the safety of night. "Again?" she asked. Sophia didn't answer. She was already loading the next set of bomb fuses. The German reaction: by the third night of the offensive, the night witches had struck over 20 German columns. Fuel trucks, artillery positions, makeshift command posts, all had felt the sting of canvas wings. The German response became desperate. Order after order crackled across radios: beware the witches. They come when you are tired. They come when you think you are safe. They come when night falls. Flak units were repositioned. Searchlights were doubled. Anti-air machine guns were placed on tank turrets. But nothing stopped them. One German officer wrote in his diary, "They fall from the sky like ghosts. You hear nothing until the bomb leaves their hand. Then you are already dead." The duel in the forest: on the 9th night of the Kursk operation, the Germans finally sent someone who could stop them. An ace. Silent, experienced, relentless. He knew their tactics. He knew their weaknesses. And he waited in the dark. Nadia and Sophia were flying a deep strike mission that night, a target beyond the first line of armor. As they crossed a forested ravine, Nadia felt something, a tremor in the air. A sense of movement where there should have been stillness. She didn't see him. She heard him. A faint whine, a predator's hum, the Messerschmitt dove from above, silent as a blade. Tracer fire ripped past the Po-2's tail. One round grazed the right wingtip, punching a neat hole through the canvas. Sophia screamed, "Break! Break!" Nadia yanked the stick. The Po-2 snapped into a low turn, wings brushing treetops. The German fighter overshot, too fast, too heavy, but he knew how to hunt. He came back around. Nadia made a decision that would have seemed insane to any pilot alive. She flew into the trees. The Po-2 skimmed through the forest canopy, branches slapping at the wings, the world reduced to darkness and the smell of pine. The Messerschmitt couldn't follow, not without committing suicide. He circled above, searching, hunting. Then Nadia did the impossible. She brought the plane up under a ridge, cut the engine, and let gravity pull the aircraft into a silent drift. The Po-2 glided upward, rising from the forest like a ghost lifting from a grave. The Messerschmitt passed overhead, close enough that Sophia could see the frost on its underside, and Nadia restarted the engine, not to run, to attack. She swung behind the fighter, closing in on its tail. She had no guns. But she had a plan. She aimed the Po-2 directly at the Messerschmitt's blind spot, too slow to shoot, too close to turn, too unexpected to counter. The German pilot panicked. He jerked the stick too hard. The fighter stalled just enough. His wing clipped a treetop. Then another. The Messerschmitt spiraled into darkness. The forest swallowed him whole. Nadia didn't cheer. She didn't blink. She simply pulled away and whispered, "One less hunter." The witches turned the tide as the Kursk offensive raged. The night witches flew over 40 missions a night as a regiment. Ammunition dumps exploded. Fuel depots vanished in storms of fire. Tank columns stalled in the mud. Infantry units lost sleep night after night. And slowly, inch by inch, the German advance faltered. The tide of war shifted. The night witches weren't the reason for victory, but they were the shadow that pushed it forward. They were the whisper that broke an army's nerves. They were the darkness between the German soldiers and their rest. By the time the battle ended, the night witches had flown more combat missions than any other women's regiment in the world. They had earned their name. Not from fear, not from superstition, but from respect, from terror, from the undeniable truth that they owned the night. The summer of 1943 bled into autumn with no ceremony, no gentle turn of season, only the grinding roar of war shifting west. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable steel avalanche it once had been. It was still dangerous, still vicious, but something essential had cracked in its armor. The Soviets felt it. The Germans felt it. And the night witches, who had lived on the margins of the front like shadows with wings, felt it most of all. Their next orders brought them north and west into Belarus, a land of marshes, forests, and dark rivers, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe mystery. Villages lay hidden beneath birch canopies, and mist rose from the Swan like smoke from unseen fires. It was a land that swallowed armies, a land where movement became treacherous and the night seemed to run forever. Perfect conditions for witches. The 588th moved into a hastily prepared field near Bryansk, a strip barely long enough for their light biplanes. The ground crews worked tirelessly, turning a patch of wild grass into a living runway. Trenches were dug for shelter, fuel was brought in barrels, and bombs were stacked under nets woven with twigs and leaves. The women stepped off their transport trucks with tired eyes and cracked lips, clutching scarves against the wind. The silence of the woods unnerved them. After months of fighting near Kursk, where the ground shook every hour, the quiet felt alien, like the world was waiting, holding its breath. Then the first briefing came. They wouldn't just be bombing supply lines anymore. They wouldn't just be harassing advancing armor or attacking railroads. Their new mission was more dangerous, more delicate, more secretive. They were going to support partisan forces, Soviet resistance fighters trapped behind German lines. They would carry messages, ammunition, medicine, even food. They would locate hidden German garrisons. They would hit bridges used for troop movements. And sometimes they would evacuate wounded partisans, cramming men with bullet wounds into the back of their tiny Po-2s and taking off under fire. This was not just war, it was infiltration, and nobody infiltrated the night like witches. The first flight with the partisans, the forests of Belarus were thick, ancient, almost primeval. Flying above them at night was like hovering over an ocean of black needles. Even the moon could not through the canopy's shadow. The Po-2's engine seemed muted by the density of the trees. On their first mission into partisan territory, Nadia Popova and Sofia Ryabova flew low, following a thin thread of river that glimmered like a silver scar. They carried medicine, ammunition, and a single-coded message inside a wax-sealed envelope that Sofia tucked beneath her coat. The rendezvous point was a clearing deep in the woods, a place the partisans had prepared by cutting down trees by hand and smoothing the earth with logs. There were no lights, no signals, only a torch that would flash once, only once if the landing zone was safe. If it flashed twice, it meant Germans were waiting. A trap. Death. Nadia circled high above while Sofia scanned the ground. Minutes passed. Then a single flame blinked through the leaves. Just once, like the eye of something alive. Safe, Sophia whispered. But it wasn't safe. Not really. Nothing about this war ever was. Nadia dropped the Po-2 into a long glide. The trees rose up on both sides, branches so close that Sophia could almost touch them. The aircraft skimmed over the treetops, dipped into the clearing, bounced once, then slid to a stop. The partisans emerged like ghosts, thin, gaunt rifles slung across shoulders, eyes bright with suspicion and hunger. Their leader stepped forward, a man with a heavy beard and a bandage wrapped around his right hand. "You came," he said. "We always come," Nadia replied simply. They handed over the supplies, received new coordinates for future missions, and prepared to take off again. But then the partisan leader pointed to a makeshift stretcher. "Take him." A wounded boy, no more than 16, lay on it, pale as ash, blood soaking his shirt. "Load him," Nadia ordered. They strapped the stretcher across the back of the cockpit, the boy's head resting against a spare parachute. He groaned softly as the engine sputtered to life. The takeoff was brutal. The plane skidded through mud, clipped a branch, then finally lifted into the air, wobbling dangerously. Sophia placed a hand on the boy's forehead. "You'll make it," she murmured, forcing her voice to be steady. "You survived the forest. You'll survive the sky." And somehow he did. The Germans quickly realized something had changed in the region. Supply trucks disappeared. Isolated outposts were overrun. Bridges that had stood for decades were gone overnight. They blamed the partisans, but they also blamed the witches. German patrols began sweeping the forests. Searchlights were mounted on trucks and driven through the woods. Flak units were placed at the edges of clearings. And when a Po-2 was sighted, the reaction was immediate and violent. Bullets tore through branches. Tracer fire clawed at the sky. Dogs howled in the distance. Yet the witches kept flying. The ambush in the birchwoods one night, while returning from a delivery mission, Nadia and Sophia found themselves flying straight into a trap. A German spotlight ripped through the darkness, catching the Po-2s. A flak gun opened fire. Shells burst around them, black, violent blossoms of sound and shrapnel. Nadia banked left hard enough to make her ribs ache. The Po-2 dove toward the treetops. Branches whipped past. A shell exploded so close it flipped the aircraft onto its side. Sophia screamed as the world turned upside down. Then, as suddenly as it began, the flak stopped. They had slipped below the firing arc. But they were not out of danger. Ahead, in the clearing, German trucks were waiting, engines idling, machine guns mounted. A roadblock. Nadia's eyes hardened. She did not hesitate. She cut the engine. The aircraft became a glider again, the signature of the Night Witches. The Po-2 drifted silently over the German troops, so silently that the soldiers below didn't look up, so silently that Sophia could hear her own heartbeat. Nadia's gloved hand moved slowly to the throttle. Wait, now. The engine roared back to life. The Po-2 shot upward like a frightened animal, skimming past the treetops and disappearing into the night. Behind them, the Germans shouted in confusion, firing blindly at the empty sky. The witches turned the forest into a weapon. By late autumn. The Night Witches and the Belarusian partisans had transformed the entire region into a death trap. They struck trains at night, derailing supply cars and leaving twisted metals cross railway lines. They bombed bridges just hours before major troop movements. They mapped hidden German garrisons, enabling Soviet artillery to pound them at dawn. They delivered critical documents, codes, and medicines. The witches in rain, sleet, fog, and darkness so deep it felt alive. And slowly, inevitably, the German hold on Belarus began to crumble. The commander of one German regiment wrote in frustration, "They have taken the night itself from us. We cannot sleep. We cannot move. We cannot breathe without fear." The loss, but courage has a price. One night, a Po-2 from the 588th failed to return. A second was shot down but managed to land in a swamp. Only one woman survived. Half frozen, delirious, covered in mud up to her shoulders. When the mechanics pulled her from the stretcher, she whispered, "They were waiting for us. How did they know?" A chilling realization began to spread among the regiment. There was a collaborator, someone feeding information to the Germans. The witches were no longer fighting just tanks and searchlights. Now they were fighting betrayal. But they flew anyway. They always flew. By the first frost of winter, the night witches had become the most feared presence in the forests of Belarus. They had crippled German supply lines, saved entire partisan brigades, and turned the darkness into a weapon that no soldier could defend against. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay Poland. Ahead lay battles fiercer than anything they had survived. Ahead lay a night so long and cold that even witches feared it. Yet the engines purred, the bombs were loaded, and the sky was calling, because witches do not rest. They rise. Winter did not arrive in Poland like a season. It arrived like a predator. The cold sharpened the air to a metallic sting, frost crept across every surface like a silent contagion, and the wind keened through the forest with a voice that seemed almost human. Snow buried roads, hills, and trenches, erasing familiar landscapes and replacing them with a white wasteland that could swallow the unprepared whole. But for the night witches, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, this was nothing new. They had flown through the freezing tempests of the Caucasus. They had navigated the lightning-torn nights of Kursk. They had soared above the burning forests of Belarus. Now their mission shifted once more, becoming harder, colder, sharper. Hunt the retreating German army. Cut them down before they reach the next defensive line. Do not let them escape. The Po-2s were prepared for their most brutal campaign yet. The aircraft, wooden, canvas-skinned, deceptively fragile, were modified for winter operations. Mechanics wrapped the engines in blankets soaked with heated oil. They drained coolant by hand and replaced it with antifreeze mixtures that smelled like death and chemistry. They hammered ice off wings with bare knuckles when tools froze solid. The women themselves were no better off. Their eyelashes froze. Their breath turned to crystals in their scarves. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and cheeks. More than once, a pilot landed with blood frozen on her skin where the cold had split it open. But their resolve hardened with the temperature. For they knew the war was changing. Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was pushing west with unstoppable force. And the night witches were no longer defending their homeland. They were chasing their enemy. The retreat through the snow, the German forces streaming westward were broken fragments of once mighty armies. Regiments were reduced to companies, companies to squads, squads to frightened men trudging through snow with hollow eyes and torn boots. The night witches hunted them mercilessly. Reports came in hourly. Convoys moving through the Carpathians, fuel trucks hidden under camouflage nets, railway cars loaded with ammunition. Columns of infantry marching through narrow forest passes every night. The 588th launched wave after wave of sorties. 5 missions, 8 missions, sometimes 10 per crew. They struck armor columns, burned supply depots, scattered infantry, and forced already exhausted soldiers to spend yet another night without sleep. They were not just bombers. They were tormentors. They were the night itself, made flesh and engine. The Battle of the Frozen Pass in December 1944, the Night Witches received a critical assignment. A German column, nearly 500 men, had barricaded themselves in a narrow forest pass outside Lublin, using the terrain to slow the Soviet advance. They had ammunition, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons. They intended to hold out until reinforcements arrived. The Red Army could not break through. The order came, send in the witches. Nadia Popova's Po-2 was among the first to take off. The wind sliced across the airfield like a knife as she and Sophia climbed into the cockpit. Sophia's fingers shook as she adjusted the compass, not from fear, but from cold so deep it made her bones ache. The sky was a void. No stars, no moon. Just black and snow swirling like ash in a dead world. When they reached the pass, they could see faint flickering lights below, campfires shielded by sheets of metal. Men huddled around them, trying to survive another night in war and winter. Sophia leaned out of the cockpit. Wind slapped her face raw. She counted the fires, watched the shadows. There, she said. 3 machine gun nests, 2 artillery pieces. And tracer fire erupted. The Germans had expected bombers. Heavy, loud, predictable. What they got instead was a whisper. Nadia cut the engine. The Po-2 slid through the darkness like a falling snowflake, invisible, silent, righteous. They glided between two ridges so close Nadia could see individual flakes of snow on the rock faces. The machine gun bullets sliced the air behind them, too high, too late. Sophia pulled the bomb lanyard. A string of small bombs, each barely bigger than a milk jug, fell directly into the German camp. The night exploded. The campfires vanished. Men screamed, canvas shelters shredded. Wooden crates burst into flames. A machine gun nest disappeared under a shower of icy dirt. Nadia reignited the engine. The Po-2 darted upward. But the Germans were not beaten yet. A second machine gun began firing, and this one saw them. Bullets ripped through the air. Tracer fire stitched the darkness like threads of fire. One round punched through the left wing, tearing a jagged hole. Sophia grabbed the edge of her seat. "We have to go," she shouted over the wind, but Nadia shook her head. "Not yet." She dove again, lower than before, lower than any Po-2 should ever fly, until the skis nearly brushed the snow. The machine gun pivoted to track them. Then Nadia pulled up sharply. The sudden climb confused the gunner. His shots went wild. The second wave of night witches arrived. Their bombs fell in perfect unison. The machine gun pit vanished. The pass was broken. The German force, cold, exhausted, scattered, began to retreat again, leaving behind weapons, wounded, and the remains of their last hope. The empty town weeks later, the witches were ordered to investigate reports of a German garrison hiding in a small village. When Nadia and Sophia arrived overhead, the streets were silent. Houses were intact. Smoke rose from chimneys, but there were no people. Sophia spotted movement. A figure emerged from a doorway. An old man with a white beard, hands raised. He stared up at the Po-2 as if seeing an angel or a demon. Behind him, a line of villagers appeared, thin, scared, holding candles. The Germans had abandoned the town hours earlier. They left behind their wounded. They left behind their stolen food. They left behind their prisoners. That night, the night witches didn't drop bombs, they dropped supplies. Ammunition, bread, medicine, blankets. For once, their arrival in the night brought light instead of fire. The old man bowed deeply as the Po-2 circled overhead. Sophia whispered, "We saved someone tonight." Nadia didn't speak, but her eyes softened, a rare thing in war. The price of winter, but winter on the front always demanded payment. One night during a routine strike, a Po-2 hit a downdraft and slammed into the treetops. The aircraft crumpled. Snow buried the wreck. The two women inside died instantly. The regiment mourned, quietly, without ceremony. Then they flew again, because that was how you honored the dead in this war, by continuing their mission. The night before the Vistula River crossing, by early January 1945, the Soviet army prepared for a massive offensive, the Vistula Oder operation. The Night Witches were given a crucial task: destroy every German supply point between Warsaw and Krakow. Make the enemy starve, make them freeze, make them unable to run. Finally, after a month of relentless night attacks, the Soviet infantry crossed the Vistula. Poland began to shake itself free. The witches had done their part, but the war was not over. Not yet. Ahead lay East Prussia. Ahead lay Germany itself, and the darkest missions of all. By the spring of 1945, the world was breathing differently. The air itself seemed to tremble with the weight of what was coming. The German Reich, once a machine that devoured nations, was collapsing inch by inch, street by street, heartbeat by heartbeat. The Red Army had broken through Poland, stormed across the Oder River, and now stared straight into the heart of the beast, Berlin. And behind them, as always in the black hours between dusk and dawn, flew the Night Witches, weary, hardened, unbroken. They had begun this war as girls. They had become legends. Now they were shadows moving across Europe's dying empire, whispering through the night like a final omen. The closer they came to Germany, the more battered the land became. Towns burned black. Villages were hollow shells. Roads were broken ribs of stone. Forests were splintered by artillery, fields churned into wasteland, and the sky was never dark anymore. Searchlights, tracer fire, burning buildings, artillery flashes. The world below was a storm of light and death. Yet the Po-2s still flew. They always flew, because the night, no matter how bright with fire, still belonged to them. The final border crossing into Germany was nothing like crossing into Belarus or Poland. Here, every village had flak positions. Every forest hid a machine gun nest. Every road carried retreating soldiers or desperate reinforcements. The Night Witch's mission was simple: break everything that moves, blind everything that watches, silence everything that shoots. Their targets grew heavier. Retreating armored units, ammunition depots hidden in barns, fuel reserves near the Oder River, makeshift command posts inside schoolhouses, flak batteries protecting the approaches. Berlin, the Germans, knowing the end was near, fought like wounded animals, vicious, cornered, unpredictable. Searchlights roamed the sky like hungry fingers. Flak filled the air with shrapnel so dense it seemed like flying through gravel, and still the witches rose into the night. The last winter mission, in February 1945, Nadia Popova flew one of her most dangerous missions: destroy a fuel storage site on the outskirts of Kustrin, a fortress town guarding the road to Berlin. If the Soviet tanks reached Kustrin without starving its defenders, the battle for Berlin might drag on for months. But if the city's fuel supply burned, the 588th moved at midnight. Nadia and Sophia climbed into their frozen cockpit, breath turning to ice crystals as they spoke. "Fuel?" Nadia asked. "Barely enough to get us back," Sophia replied. "Perfect," Nadia said. They lifted off into a sky torn with lightning, winter lightning, the kind that split the clouds but made no sound. Below them, the Oder River reflected the flashes like broken glass. German searchlights caught the first wave of Po-2s, bathing them in white cones. Flak burst like black flowers. Nadia threw the plane sideways, a maneuver no heavy aircraft could survive. The Po-2 fluttered like a falling leaf, then leveled out. "Target ahead," Sophia whispered. The fuel tanks stood beneath camouflage nets, huge metal cylinders, dim and ominous. Nadia killed the engine. Silence dropped over them. The Po-2 became a ghost. Sophia leaned out into the freezing wind. Her fingers were numb, her face stung. She released the first bomb. It struck the camouflage netting, tearing it open. The second fell between two fuel cylinders. The third hit the ground near a truck loaded with barrels. The fourth, the night turned white. The explosion was so violent it flattened small trees. The fireball rose like a sunrise. Sophia screamed as the shockwave struck the plane. The Po-2 flipped, violently, horribly, rolling onto its back. For one endless second, the world was upside down. Nadia fought the stick with everything she had. The left wing buckled. The right wing trembled. Then, with a groan like a dying animal, the Po-2 rolled upright. Sophia gasped, clutching her chest. Nadia breathed once, deeply, like someone stealing air from death itself. "Let's go home," she said. Behind them, Kustrin burned. The road to Berlin, in April 1945, the Red Army broke through the German lines and surrounded Berlin. The world's last great battle of the war was beginning. The Night Witches were given one final, terrible assignment: fly into Berlin. Strike the remaining artillery batteries. Disrupt communications. Prevent any reinforcement from reaching the city. Berlin was a fortress of fire now. Buildings burned for days. Streets were craters. Civilians ran like ghosts through the rubble. The Luftwaffe was nearly gone, but the flak batteries were not. They were desperate, frantic, firing at shadows. A Po-2 drifting through that sky was both invisible and possibly vulnerable. The witches prepared anyway. They wrapped extra scarves around their necks. They tied letters from home inside their jackets. They tightened their boots. And they flew. The last flight, Nadia and Sophia's final mission, was to strike an artillery command post inside a shattered residential block near the Tiergarten. The flight would take them low over the Spree River and into the heaviest flak zone in Berlin. They took off in silence. The engine hummed. The night was thick with smoke. Embers drifted like dying stars. Berlin glowed beneath them, not with light, but with destruction. As they crossed the city's edge, searchlights clawed upward. Tracer fire spiraled. Buildings burned like broken candles. Sophia leaned close to Nadia's ear. "If we die tonight," she said softly, "at least we die at the end." Nadia didn't answer. She had no words left. She cut the engine. The Po, too, became silent. Below them, German soldiers manned a rooftop flak battery. One of them looked up, confused, squinting into the smoke. Sophia dropped the bombs. The building shook as the command post exploded. The flak battery vanished beneath rubble. They reignited the engine and fled west through the burning city. Tracer fire followed them. Searchlights pierced the clouds. But the Po-2 slipped through it all like a witch slipping through fingers. They reached friendly lines just before dawn. Their aircraft landed hard, so hard the left wheel broke. But they were alive. Mechanics rushed to them, pulling them from the cockpit. Nadia stood trembling. Sophia wept silently into her scarf. The sun rose over Berlin. The war was ending. The end of the night on May 8, 1945, surrendered. The night witches, the women who had flown 30,000 sorties, who had bombed the enemy with training planes, who had fought with nothing but skill and courage, were finally ordered to stand down. Some went home. Some became instructors. Some never flew again. Nadia Popova survived the war, married a fellow pilot, and lived into her 90s. Sophia built a new life far from the fields of fire. Many others lived quietly, their wartime heroism forgotten by the world. But the Germans never forgot. To them, the witches were more terrifying than any tank or bomber. They were the breath of death in the dark. They were the sound of canvas wings in a moonless sky. They were the reminders that courage has no shape, no gender, no limit. And when the night is quiet, when the wind is cold, when the world seems to hold its breath, some say you can steer the faint whisper of their engines. The witches who owned the night. The women who turned darkness into a weapon. The regiment that never broke. The night witches. The sky was theirs forever.